So we are going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Elizabeth Aloni and welcome. I'm with Schneps Media. Schneps Media is the largest media company in the New York metro area. We publish over 70 newspapers, magazines, websites, webinars, podcasts, and events throughout Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, Westchester, Long Island, and Philadelphia. Today, we're thrilled to bring you the webinar, What Does the Post-Pandemic Office Look Like? You know, academic and tech visionaries have been talking about working differently since the 1980s, but it took COVID-19 forcing a mass remote work experiment on the world for many people and organizations to really consider the possibilities and implications. Today, we have a panel of experts who will share their research and experience on what does the post-pandemic office look like. I'd love to introduce them now. First, I'd like to welcome David Ehrenberg. David is the president and CEO at the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, overseeing its ongoing expansion efforts and diverse tenant base, from robotics, manufacturing, and transportation companies to transmitter brewing. Before joining the Navy Yard in 2013, he was executive vice president at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, managing many of the city's priority economic development projects, including the redevelopment of Seward Park on the Lower East Side and the Atlantic Yards project. He's no stranger to helping businesses through major disruption, as he oversaw hundreds of millions of dollars of programs supporting small businesses after Hurricane Sandy. Welcome, David. Next, I'd like to welcome Guy Vardy. Guy is the Chief Innovation Officer for Silverstein Properties. He joined the company in 2016 to oversee the firm's innovation efforts and change management. Before joining Silverstein Properties, he co-founded Matific, a startup that empowers teachers and encourages students to discover and explore mathematical concepts through playful interaction. And he helped found Oberon Media, a company that expands and diversifies the demographics of computer games. Guy started his career as an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces and later spent several years developing innovative digital experiences and interactive models for the Israeli Defense Forces. Welcome, Guy. And I would also love to welcome Anne-Laure Fayard. Anne-Laure is an associate professor in innovation, design, and organizational studies at NYU Tandon School of Engineering with an affiliation at NYU Stern, and is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. She's a qualitative researcher studying collaboration and work at the intersection between organizations, technology, and people. She's passionate about human-centered design and social innovation. Her work has been published in several leading journals, such as Organization Science and Harvard Business Review. And her research is frequently highlighted in major publications like the New York Times, Financial Times, The Economist, and The Guardian. She also co-authored a book on the power of writing in organizations. Prior to joining NYU Tandon, Anne-Laure was a faculty member at INSEAD and a visiting scholar at Imperial College in London. She holds a PhD in cognitive science, Masters of Philosophy in Cognitive Science, History, and Philosophy, and a Master of Arts in Philosophy. Anne-Laure has been studying organizational spaces for more than a decade, with her research on open space and collaboration published in a highly cited Harvard Business Review article in 2011, along with op-eds in the New York Times. Last spring, with the global lockdown, Anne-Laure started doing research on the impact of remote work and hybrid offices with two of her colleagues based in Europe. This led to a Harvard Business Review article and podcast on designing the hybrid office that serves as the basis for the discussion today. Welcome to our esteemed panelists. We're so happy to have you with us today. So I'd like to get started with Anne-Laure and her research about how design, technology, and management practices can be used to make tomorrow's offices more effective as social learning and innovation spaces. Anne-Laure?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be able to be in a panel with Guy and Eric. So I'm going to try to see if I can share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that is perfect.
Okay, cool. Great. And so I'll start with a few remarks to kick us off for the panel, based really on the research that I've been doing since March 2020 on the impact of the lockdown on office and work in general. And it's based, so as you said, on an article that we published in March in the Harvard Business Review called Design the Hybrid Office from Workplace to Culture Space. And I'll touch upon that very quickly. Let me see if I can. Okay, so, you know, I'm sure everybody remembers that like March 2020, we kind of all got into a lockdown. And so the traditional 9 to 5 or 8 to 6, depending on the industry, and the idea that we all have to go to a building to work kind of was swept away, and we all ended up working from home and becoming like these little flat faces on the Zoom or Meet Teams video conference, and it led some, you know, company back in May 2020 already. A lot of company started saying, oh well, you know, you don't have to come back ever to the office. And then during the summer and this fall, there's been back and forth and a lot of debate, and so we went from work from home to work from anywhere into this notion of hybrid work. And so if you look at the recent surveys, you have a kind of a, you know, only a few companies who still say we're going to send people, you know, keep people remote all the time. And then you have a few company, you know, JP Morgan CEO has been very vocal about that, but we need to get everybody back in the office. And then in the middle, you have a lot of company who've been wondering, how are we going to keep some of the flexibility that people, you know, got and like, and then still, you know, use the office. So in January, Steelcase had a global report, and they found from their interviews that about 72% of the companies were looking at hybrid work. And then in April, they had a second report, and it went up to 85%. And, you know, in my latest, like in the last 3 months, I've been talking and consulting with a lot of organizations, and that really reflects this trend to thinking about what is hybrid work. And so on the employee side, I think that what people learned is that they want control and choice about where they want to work. And so if you look at the surveys, all of them kind of agree at 75% of people want to work at least 1 day a week from home. And then, you know, recently there was this result that like 4 million people, you know, in April said, I quit my job. And there are many reasons why they did that, but it was interesting because in the last few months, a lot of the company I've been talking to have been very aware that there's a war for talent, and that a lot of people want to keep the flexibility, and that they were ready to shift and quit their job if they didn't have the flexibility they wanted. So of course, the 4 million people is not only about hybrid work, but I think it kind of reflects a tendency. So I just wanted us to kind of pause 2 seconds. I think that what the pandemic showed us is it led us to revisit our assumption that first, the office is not necessarily where the work is done. And I think that it was shown by, you know, March, April last year, everybody was worried about like, oh, productivity is going to go down. It didn't go down, it went up. We have a lot of burnout and mental health issue on the employee side, but it went up. And it really showed that what a lot of sociologists and organizational scholars already knew is that, you know, a lot of the things that happen in the office, and I'll get back to that, is not necessarily work. And then I just want also to remind us that remote work is not new. There's been, you know, online communities, distributed work for a lot of time. And if you work in a global company, you're already doing remote work or hybrid work, in fact, in some way or fashion. So why the office? Okay, if it's not where we're doing work, what do we do? And so what we found in our study is the office has really 3 roles. First, it's to nurture relationship. It's really to connect with people. It's the social, you know, the human moment, this social relationship. And I think that's what a lot of people have been craving, whether it's in the office or even just outside of the office. The second one is it supports informal learning. So we can learn a lot of things in books or online. We can go to training. But a lot of things that we learn about our job is by just listening to what the others or watching what the others are doing, or being able to ask these small little questions. And once you get online, and that came up in a lot of our interviews, partly of like new employees, is like, you feel uncomfortable sending the email, or even if it's a message on whatever is the platform you're using, because suddenly it's more formal than just bumping or turning your head and asking someone in the office. And so that came up a lot. How do we onboard? How do we mentor? How do we develop and grow our employees? Managers are very aware about the problem, and employees were also aware that that was something that they might miss. And the last piece is the office is the place where unstructured collaboration happen. So of course we collaborate with people within a project or in a team, but there's a lot of other types of collaboration, much more informal, much more implicit. And that's where you talk with, it's the usual, water cooler or coffee machine types of conversation, or the elevator types of chat. But in these moments, what our work and many other studies show, that's where we build trust. That's where we build connection. We learn something and we might continue a project later on. That's really what social capital is. And Microsoft run a lot of research, run a lot of studies in the last year showing how our social capital has shrunk as we were, all remote. So if you're thinking about these three roles of the office, but you know that you want to have some flexibility because people want it, and we realize that we're going to have to build upon or leverage their needs, then there are three enablers of hybrid work: space, technology, and organizational processes. And very briefly, I'll just highlight the principle, and then we can talk more about them in the questions. So design principle, I think that a lot of recent work has highlighted how we want to have like more open space for collaboration and informal collaboration. But I think it's important to kind of balance that with still thinking about individual work, because some people will still come to the office because they need to do individual work. So balancing that. And that goes, again, the open needs also to be unclosed. We need to be able to either be alone or just work in small group. And if you're like trying to do team meeting in a big open plan office, we're going back to all the criticism that we've seen on open plan offices, a few years ago. So I think modularity is going to be really key. And remembering that because it's hybrid, it means we're going to have to combine physical and virtual. The second, technology, I think clearly is becoming key. We need to have ubiquitous access, and it means a flexible and resilient infrastructure. And it means access not only from the office, but also from home, so that we can go navigate from one to the other without, having issues. An inclusive experience for both remote and physically present. A big question that comes up all the time is like, how do we manage hybrid meetings? And then privacy. So of course, there's the data safety, but it's also being aware of being careful and not get into surveillance, because we want to check what people are doing when they're remote. And then organizational processes. So trust, transparency, new norms, thinking about inclusion, moving from time-based metrics to outcome-based metrics, flexibility, realizing that we have like what the pandemic showed, which we should have known, is that there are a lot of different needs in terms of individuals, background, family experience, functions, and then these might change over time. So flexibility is key. Roles, I think leaders, and there was a recent research also on the new roles also for managers are becoming role models and need to enact the norms and create and sustain bonds. There might be also new roles, meeting facilitator or office managers, and then planning for break. I think that realizing that the burnout is there for people. And so keeping that in mind also is really important. So I think that in all, there's an opportunity to reset work, not only the office, but like the way we're thinking about work. And the two, things that comes to mind for me is really flexibility. We need to experiment and iterate. And oftentimes, companies are like, what are the others doing? And I'm like, they're doing like you. They're just trying to figure it out. And I think it's going to take some time. And that's my second, principle, which is I think that behaviors and practices take time to change, and they need to be cultivated. So there's a little bit of patience that we're going to have to as we're experimenting. So that's it, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to try to figure out how I stop sharing my slides. Yes, I can find that.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. really valuable, that what you looked into, and what we're all experiencing. I think your research really points to so much of that that's going on. So I'd like to turn to our panelists to get their viewpoints on the workplace post-pandemic. So if hybrid is here to stay, what is that going to mean in terms of space and work arrangement? You talked a little bit about that in your research. Guy, would you like to share?
Yes. So when we are looking on how companies adjust to the new normal, what we are seeing three archetypes. The common theme is everyone is very confused. Companies are very successful at building best practices, and suddenly the best practices are no longer applicable. So we see three kinds of adjustment. And all of them, by the way, are being driven by the best practices. One, let's ignore it. It's noise. We have a tradition that we built in the last couple of years. Everything is fine. Maybe not everyone is going to come every day to the office. Maybe we are going to give Friday off and going to claim that we are a hybrid environment, but nothing fundamental is going to change. Second view is great. If not everyone coming back to the office, we don't need as much as real estate before. So again, it's a very transactional thinking, no fundamental change in the way that we are going to work, but we don't need as much space as before. We are going to use hot desking, hoteling, and either we are going to shrink or not expand our real estate footprint. And the third way is saying, okay, that's true that not everyone coming to the office and the role of the office is changing. So let's try to see how we can compete with home in providing areas that are going to lure employees to the benefit that the office can provide. So we see range of amenities, anything from more collaborative space to design elements that encourage unstructured collaboration, to areas that provide more flexibility to the employees, compete with the couch versus the kitchen versus the bedroom, and restore this area in the office. It's very difficult to know what's going to be the steady state. It's also very different industry by industry. We see that tech is more forward thinking, specifically because the one that making the decision is the employee, is the talent, it's not the leader. We see financial services more conservative.
So it seems that the changes are kind of in line with the type of organization that it was to start. And you're seeing those changes happen in line with that.
Yeah, I think that the major driver here is less about how traditional or conservative the organization is. It's more about who has the power, whether it's the leadership or the employees.
Interesting. That's interesting. Anne-Laure, what do you have to say about some of that, and also the trends that you're seeing in companies that are planning to bring people back?
Yeah, so first of all, I like the archetype that Guy describes, because I think that they kind of reflect, well, I guess because of the companies that reach out to me are more type 2 and type 3 than type 1, because type 1, they don't want to talk to me because they think it's just noise. But I think that there's also this notion about like how, might we shrink the real estate? And I think that, a lot of lately I was discussing with architecture firms, and they were claiming if you're type 3, you might not be able to shrink your real estate because you might need, as much space, maybe even more, but at least as much space to create this new arrangement. So I think that this idea of like, less or more is kind of I think people should wait and try to figure out how it works. Industry clearly varies. I mean, on the financial services, I mentioned JP Morgan because they've been very vocal about like bringing back people to the office. But talking with other companies, I think that in financial services, for example, there's a big group of people who are more have a tech background. And so, for example, I mentioned war for talent. A few of the financial services company I've been talking to are very aware that, between a conservative financial service organization versus a tech company, people might go to the tech if it's more flexible. So I think that, it's kind of forcing people to rethink what they're organizing. But yes, industry is very important. And I think also functions. So I was talking with a law firm, and they realized that a lot of their, lawyer, there was a senior, junior, there was a variation, but they were more, all of them were ready to go back to the office, at least, for a few days a week. But all the staff, which is about half of the company, was like, we don't want to come back. And one reason is they're further away from the office, so it's more expensive, longer commute, and they probably have all figured out different arrangement for childcare and things like that. And it was really interesting because the senior management was like, this is 50% of our workforce, and they're very important. We can't just ignore them. And so they were really trying to rethink, how are we going to convince our senior partner that maybe, they'll be in the office and their assistant will be at home, and that's okay. So I think it's also very interesting to see that there are, it's going back to the power in a way, because, a lot of these people might say, well, I quit, but if they quit, there are talents that are very important. Invisible workers that we didn't, we talked a lot about invisible workers during the pandemics, but I think even in office work, there are different, people that are coming out now. So I think that's an interesting thing to be looking at.
Absolutely. And it really is, I didn't think about it like that, but it is about the power. 50% of your employees are going to leave. That's a tremendous amount of power. But, that begs the question, who should be making these decisions? And what is the role of leadership in successfully managing the return to the office? Because if we're planning on making these changes, how should they be structured? And how should those decisions be made? And who should really be making them? Guy?
So it's a complicated answer because, as I said, some organizations are more driven by talent. So effectively, the leadership is going to reflect the will of the workforce. Otherwise, they're not going to be effective, because you can be the best leaders, but without the foot soldiers, you are not going to be a great general. So that's one. The interesting part here, I think it's about flexibility and control and trust. What we are seeing that the traditional measures of measuring output of employees, aka how much hours a day you put in the work, become obsolete. And some companies have hard time to adjust to that, and some employees have hard time to adjust to that. And we see a spike, for instance, in the number of meetings during working from home. One of the reasons for that is that managers need more control. And they achieve that control by inflating the number of meetings in the calendar just to know what's going on. So when you're talking about the hybrid office, suddenly the equation slightly changed because the employee become more autonomous. The flexibility, it's not only the days that you're going to come to the office, but making the decision whether you're going to work right now or take your kids to school. And that's very difficult to give up. On the other end, some organization really likes that level of control. So there is almost a built-in tension between the culture of the organization with the emotional needs of the employees, and every company is based on their culture and challenges create a new balance. So if I need to choose one term on how a leader should react in this area, I think it's just empathy, because there is a high level of uncertainty. COVID is not 100% gone. There is a post-trauma to a lot of people in an unstructured environment.
At a time when people want a lot of answers, sometimes you just have to have empathy and patience.
Exactly.
Really good point. Anne-Laure, what do you think about that in terms of the role of leadership?
So I think empathy is key, and transparency. And I think that what I've heard, in the last few months is people need to know something. So, a lot of companies have been holding off to make decisions. And that's been very difficult for people. They'd rather, know that it's one or the other, or that even that you don't know, but this kind of uncertainty has been really, really hard on people. I completely agree. I think organizational culture is going to play a role in the way people are going to react. But I think that what is really important, if you want to use this as an opportunity to be inclusive, is to listen to people. to listen to their different needs. So that means probably inviting, opening up for conversations and trying to understand. And so I've seen, quite a few companies are starting either doing surveys or small focus groups to get a sense of what people want. I think that even sometimes you might see variations within an organization, depending on the kind of work people are doing, or the different. So you can come up with template, because I think that's what people want. Okay, it's like, oh, we're going to have like these new rules of like how many days and how, and it might varies. You can have like a decision as a company overall, but then it might varies in the types of work that people are doing. So I was talking with an organization, and the manager, the way his team works is they have like a period of intense work, about 10 days, every quarters. And so he was thinking, well, these 10 days, everybody has to be in the office. But then he thought, well, maybe I'll ask them. And he asked his team, and they're like, no, that's the day we don't want, because we're working 16 hours per day. So we don't want to add the commute to that. So we'd better do it from home. And maybe we do just the last day to just coordinate. And so he was like, oh, I never thought about that. It makes sense. And so he decided to shift the way he was thinking about things. So I think it's like, empathy, also realizing that you don't necessarily know exactly what are the needs of people and what's their, requirements in terms, and even in terms of work, we don't work according to the instruction manual. And so understanding that is super important. I think the point also about trust and control is also essential. It's really challenging a kind of a top-down ways of thinking about work. And I sometimes tell people when they're like, oh, how do I know? I'm like, we know because you've seen it for nearly a year. People have worked. And they worked there were a couple of studies showing that people on average have worked more than 6 hours extra per week. And we can look at the burnout. And so there's no like people were working when you were like not behind their back. So I think that like really shifting that way of thinking is going to be super important. So yeah, I think that's the main. One last thing is I think that whatever decision you do is realizing that you have to enact it in practice. So let's say if you tell people like, oh, we want you to come back to the office, because as Guy said, there are a lot of companies who like, oh, we have to make the office, the proposition value of the office exciting for people to come. So you're like, oh, we're gonna have informal collaboration and this and that. But then if people come to the office and then they're back-to-back office meetings all day long, they're going to be like, I don't see the point. Okay. Or if they're like, oh, you'll be able to see your manager and have mentoring, but then the manager is, in a meeting room all day long again. So I think that also realizing that whatever are your decision, being ready to make this decision and implement them like that, whatever you do as a leader is going to be interpreted by people. So it's not only about saying like, oh, it's flexible, but then if the rest is not flexible, you can say it. People will realize that it's not the case.
Yeah, it's not just about ordering a couch and a great coffee bar. It's about really thinking about how the day is structured and how you can actually enact what you're promising is going to happen. So, when you talked about moving to working so much more, our technology, I think, has changed that over probably the last 10 years, that people are always plugged in. But what role does technology play in decision-making in this whole new way of working? I mean, Zoom's become my best friend. So how does technology affect that?
So if we look on technology, there are 4 different roles. One is just an enabler. Zoom is a perfect example. In order to do your job, you need the Zoom, you need the internet connection, you need to make sure that you are available and accessible. Second one is just utilities. I want to book a room, or access control. I want to come to the office and see who other are coming. And I think that was done before COVID. It will be done after COVID. It's just becoming much more important in the post-COVID era. I think that the interesting part that I'm excited about personally are 2 things. One is the ability to create transparency and trust. and I'm not talking about the trust enforced like a big brother, but giving you a good indication what's the pro and cons of the office. For instance, at Silverstein, we use a technology developed by a subsidiary called Dojo that give you the risk of getting COVID infected in the office in different rooms. And it's available to every employee. And not only we are saying that the office is safe, but hey, this is the analysis of the office and this is the risky part. And if you want to stay in this meeting room, please don't stay more than an hour, because after an hour, it's going to be dangerous. Less than an hour wearing a mask is fine. And technology can provide this level of transparency and trust, which I think is going to be super critical. The other element that is important is the complexity becoming very, very challenging. And it's very difficult to manage that without technologies. Just to give a very quick example, on one hand, if everyone is going to decide when he's coming to the office, here goes the collaboration. Because we know that one of the biggest benefits of the office is interdepartment collaboration. Me and David are in different departments, so it's fine that my boss and David's boss are going to dictate that we are going to come on Monday and David's group are going to come on Tuesday. We achieve nothing. So we want to make sure that we have a certain level of collaboration between teams. On the other end, flexibility and autonomy is really, really important. And I really need to take my kids to his survival class on Thursday. So how do you balance between these two? And I'm not going to give up taking my son to the survival class because I've done it for the last year. So without good technology, it's going to be very, very challenging. Just one more elements there. When we look on generation by generation, their desire to come back to the office, there are two, everyone is fine with a hybrid office. There are two outliners that really likes to come back. One is the great generation, and for obvious reason. And the other one is Gen Z. And the reason that Gen Z wants to come to the office is double folded. They are the digital native, right? They are the people that were born with the iPhone in their hands. But there are two reasons for that. One is the mentorship and the informal learning that Anne-Laure talked about. And the other thing is the infrastructure at home. So if you are working in a one-bedroom apartment with partners, regardless of the technology that you have at home, the infrastructure is not there. So I think that's highlights an additional role of the office in which technology can play an important role.
That's a really good point. And to think about, what is the makeup of your employees would also give you some thought into that. And Laura, what about you about talking about technology and how that affects the new way of working?
Just before that, because I want to follow on Guy's point about the thinking about what are the needs of people. So great point. And I think Orly had a question in the chat about also how do we think about like the kind of support at home. And so I think that's the thing is, and one of the company that we interviewed had exactly the same thing. Like a lot of people, young people wanted to go back to the office because they were like, we're squeezed at home. So I think that one way out there to think about it would be to have also other options. So between the office and home, there might be a new version of a co-working space or the co-working space, or like, because also there's another piece that we tend to forget is a lot of people also left the city or, relocated. And so what does it mean and how does it work? So I think Guy's point about the technology as a way to help us plan the overlap between different groups is definitely important. I talk with very small companies who can do that. If you have 40 people, I think you can still do it on Excel, but beyond that, it becomes really complicated. And I think you can not necessarily put the survival class in the Excel spreadsheet. So, but I think that, and I think that's a very important question that everybody is, trying to figure out is like, how do we manage this overlap? And is it like, do we tell people to all come together one day a week? But then if you're trying to shrink your real estate, then doesn't work? Or do we how do we planify this connection? So I think there it will be super important. I think that video, video or like some kind of connectivity is going to be important. So one thing that I realized first is like, we all like Zoom or, few organizations are Teams, and I'm like, oh, Teams. But whatever it is, sometimes people are like, can we just call each other like, regular phone? And I'm like, oh yeah, that still exists. So I think that it might also be, and it's interesting because we read about all these things that people are tired with Zoom and some people don't want to have their camera on all the time. We kind of forgot about like a technology that we've been using before. So I think that could be one thing. But if we still stay with video, I think that's going to be also a place where we're going to have to think about like, how do we connect people who are in the meeting room face-to-face or in person and those who are remote, and how do we create these connections? So I think that's going to be another piece of things. But as you said, Elizabeth, like we and it goes back to my point about burnout, is like, we know from previous decades and from the last year that as soon as we get like too remote, then there's like a lot of things that get lost. So I think that there's going to be also a lot of new norms to be, and I've seen organizations starting thinking about like, okay, if you send an email after a certain time, you let people know that they don't have to answer right now. So I think that there's going to be, and it goes back to the control piece, and particularly for those who might be more remote and who might worry that people are going to think like they're not working, and so they're going to overdo that. And I've seen that it's been shown in previous studies, even in distributed work, that people who are working remotely tend to want to make their work more visible. And so I think that like thinking about that, so the more of a social implication of technology is going to definitely be helpful and work. But I think again, it's really important to keep that in mind. So and back to for those who are at home, is like, how do we give them some connectivity they need? How do we make sure that they have the right tools? And I think there's a question beyond technology, is if we really shrink our office space and we ask people to work from home, do we need to give them some stipend to buy a better desk or a better chair? And I've seen some companies in Europe who bought, furniture to make sure that their employees had a better setup at home. So it doesn't increase the space that you have. If you're in the studio, you're in the studio, but if you have a better chair, maybe it's already something.
No, it does make a lot of sense. Technology sometimes is just the table and the chair. And the truth is, you have to think about that to be able to have this space, to be able to have that quiet and be able to be focused. So that's definitely a critical piece. So I want to jump over to David, because, we're talking a lot about those individuals who can work remotely and who have that opportunity. But David, what about businesses and employees that didn't or don't have that option to work remotely? What steps are taken to address the workplace concerns around the pandemic?
Yeah, and we certainly have a lot of those kinds of tenants of the yard where there's a physical product a lot of the time involved, in which case all of or much of your workforce needs to be on site most of or all of the time. I think our tenants and folks in our industry are just like the other panels are saying, are experimenting and are trying to sort it out as they go. And when I speak to other executives, both in our tenants and other organizations, there is a lot of introspection and frustration, I would say, in trying to figure out what the right answer is. What we've seen at the Yard is that our, very different than Manhattan, after the pause, when people were allowed to come back to work, about 70% of our population snapped back, within the next week or so. And we're now back to about 95% of our pre-COVID traffic here at the Yard. There was a lot of work and I would also say, like, you know, our tenants represent more of the kind of small to medium-sized companies, not the big banks, not the big tech firms, which represents the majority of the employment base in the city, but may not have all of the same resources available to them, both in terms of expertise and just monetary, you know, to deal with these expenses. And so, you know, we're seeing companies make, frankly, relatively minor adjustments to their scheduling. But there is a much higher degree of expectation that the kind of work we do needs to be on site, and that you know, that's the nature of the business, and so people need to return back to the place of business. I was going to jump in a little bit earlier, just in kind of reflecting, not so much as a real estate person, but as an executive in a mid-sized company. I think there's also an interesting dynamic between short-term preferences and long-term needs that is still being that is getting kind of, I haven't seen a lot of attention paid to that in the conversation about hybrid. I totally agree that it's, you know, the question of whether you go to hybrid is largely about who's influencing the decision and who's listening to whom. But there is an interesting dynamic where, you know, I think the pieces that are most important to have at the office are the culture building pieces. You can write the legal brief, you can review the lease, you can build the financial model from home. It's extraordinarily difficult to build culture, onboarding people, training people. I think the most important thing is training managers. I've been trying for a year and a half, and I have no idea how you effectively train new managers remotely. And that those are investments, all of those go to this amorphous culture question, which is much more and much different than just breakout spaces in your office, and require a physical presence, but aren't about a physical space necessarily. And those dividends, you know, are paid 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road. And so, you know, generally speaking, I think employees have gotten very comfortable and very happy with the remote, and I will say I have as well, to some extent. But that's a short-term. There's a short-term, mid-term, long-term disconnect, I think, in who's thinking of which advantages, and being able to communicate, you know, transparently, not just gathering information from your employees, but then communicating to your employees, this is why we are coming back, because there are long-term goals that do need to be met for the long-term sustainability and health of the organization, is something that I've been speaking with a lot of executives about, and is difficult because we're in the here and now, and it's a very raw moment. But trying to communicate that longer term set of issues is something that I think is important, in which companies are going to have to grapple with a lot more.
That's a really great point. You know, I've been hiring some new people, and you're so right about that. And bringing new people on board and getting them adjusted to the culture, and just helping them to become impassioned about their work is tremendously challenging. So I think that's a really good point to think about. How do you do that when you have a culture in a company and people know each other for a long period of time? It's a little bit easier to keep that going through Zooms. But when you're talking about brand new people who don't know anybody, it's virtually impossible. And that's very difficult for a company to grow and not be able to bring new people on board.
And I think, I mean, I'd be interested to hear Anne-Laure's opinion on this, but I think that, you know, the trust and morale and culture that's built up, you know, over the years in an organization, in my experience and speaking to many other executives, has atrophied in the last year and a half, even the organizations that had it. And I credit it to, you know, humans are social creatures, and it is very easy for a manager to get frustrated with an employee, or an employee to get frustrated with a manager, and therefore maybe the employer, when that entity is behind a screen. Both because the communications are harder. There's technology answers to those things, but it is harder. You know, you don't just like stand next to somebody and like hear them talk about the 6 projects that they're working on and say, man, that seems like a lot. Maybe we should talk about prioritization. But also it's just, you know, it's like, when are you your least social? It's like when you're behind a wheel, right? Because you're in a car and the other person's in the car, and like people are antisocial in those environments. And to some extent it is, you know, even when you've got a lot of trust built up in the organization, I've seen across a bunch of companies that slowly, you know, slowly-ish atrophies just because you're at a physical remove.
I think it's a highly depends on the culture of the company. What we've seen on companies that had a strong trust, that there is a overwhelm pressure on the middle management to be the mediator between the rank and file people to top management, keep maintaining this trust, keep maintaining this remote culture. So I agree that it's a challenge, but I think in the last year or year and a half proof that it can overcome, but with a heavy price, specifically on the middle managers.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think the point of a manager is recently someone at London Business School who just like has been studying the role of manager, and in fact how it's changing and how they're adding work on them without necessarily the training. So I think that, you know, David, some people are also trying to figure out how do we not only train people to do their regular, you know, what used to be their regular manager job, but what does it mean in this new hybrid work? I just want to highlight the point about change and change over time. I think, David, it's like so true. So at 2 levels, I think that there's one, and I think that's the reason why everybody was excited, you know, last April, like April 2020 is like, oh, it's working, productivity is going up and everything. But because we were in the crisis mode and everybody was like just making it work. And I think that there was a small company that we interviewed this summer, and the CEO, I think, said it resonated with what you were saying, David. At some point, it was in Paris, and so in June, when, you know, France was reopening, he decided that people had to come back a little bit, and there's a bit of pushback because everybody kind of enjoyed the, you know, staying at home. And before that, during summer, it was nice. You could, you know, be working from the beach or the countryside. But he said exactly what you pointed, David. He told people, he's like, listen, we can keep working, but if we continue like this, in less than a year, we won't have a company anymore, because we're going to miss these elements. So I think that, like, so he articulated that, and so it was one of the funding team said, you know, I was against the going back to the office, but now I understand, and that was what was articulated. So I think it goes back to the point that, you know, both Guy and I made earlier about the trust and the communication and the transparency. So I think that also being transparent of why you're doing what you're doing. And you also, right, is like, you know, we keep saying it's experimentation, and so experimentation means we don't really know what's going to happen. So it might be that in some industry or some organization, people are going to feel more comfortable in 6 months going one way or another. So I think this change is going to be ongoing. And it's really interesting, the point that you made between we have a short-term kind of element, and then the more the long-term, and how do we navigate that? And I think that there's interest, well, it's a lot of work, but I think the communication piece is also going to be super important.
Absolutely. And David, I mean, I think that really speaks to what we wanted to talk about next is, you know, what do you think some of these lasting impacts and effects are going to be of the pandemic for businesses and New York real estate that caters to them? I mean, as people are thinking about hybrid, maybe taking less space or maybe taking more space to create a more home-like environment, what kind of lasting effects do you see?
I'd be interested in Guy's opinion here, because we operate in a very different market than your traditional office environment. You know, we're seeing very strong interest in real estate here in Brooklyn. I think it's a function of of the kind of continued strength of New York, and that, you know, while some residents did move, the core of New York's talent base is still very much here. And I think there's a, you know, growing understanding that that's not, that's staying, and is resilient and is here not just because of the presence of central business districts, but it's here for all of the other things that makes New York so great. So the kinds of tenants we attract, which are, you know, cutting edge manufacturing, product design firms, are coming to the city just as much as they were before. So, you know, that's, but we operate in a very different environment. We don't have, you know, we don't have footloose tech firms or law firms that are grappling with these things.
So you have more firms that need to be in the physical environment, so the impact isn't going to be so dramatic.
Yeah, which I would say, you know, from our perspective is also, you know, a lot of, the Navy Yard is owned by the city, managed by a not-for-profit, and part of our mission is to diversify the city's economy. And you know, I think the COVID period showed to us two things. One, that, you know, the stability of our employee base and that we didn't have employees leaving the city and taking the tax base with them was important. But also, you know, the local, as international supply chains broke down, the Navy Yard and our tenants really stepped in to produce products here in the city that I think the average New Yorker never would have imagined could be produced here or were produced here. We ended up producing 10 million units of personal protective equipment for local hospitals and first responders, all the way from simple products, all the way up to ventilators that were deployed in hospitals last spring when there was a real fear of system-wide shortages. So little plug for kind of a public policy perspective to this, and a lesson learned that the diversification is important, not just as a kind of economic development, but also, you know, international supply chains are great while they're great. And then, you know, last April, there was a real fear and a real reality of in our hospital systems of a lack of confidence in those supply chains.
Well, hopefully that'll be a positive lasting impact of the pandemic, of being able to turn more within to be able to manufacture and take over some of these things and not have to outsource it to other countries. So I think that also takes us a little bit into talking about how things affected groups differently. And I would love to hear from each of you on this about, you know, with the pandemic disproportionately affected some groups. And I wanted to get your feedback on how we can make sure that we create inclusive and equitable workplaces post-pandemic.
That's, I think, a very, very interesting challenge, and I'm not sure that we have the answers. So what we've seen right now is that the sector that is most hurt by the pandemic is working mothers. In a way that I can be the most supportive husband, and there is an agreement between my wife and myself that we are sharing the responsibility to raising the kid, but I'm talking to you right now from my office. And my kids' mother is at home with them, working from home. And we see dramatic decline in participation of women in the workforce. It's a big challenge. We try at Silverstein to establish daycares in the office buildings in a way to facilitate that. It's very, very challenging. You look on the code requirements, assuming that there is no economic issue there, that we want to do that, just meeting the code requirements, it's killing it on delivery in New York. We are doing it in LA before we are doing it in New York, although most of our portfolio is in New York because no one thought about it before. Wow. So just that by itself is an issue. In addition, I think that people confuse the term work and the term career. They look at them as a synonym, and they are not. And it's very difficult you can achieve your work from home, but it's very difficult to advance your career. If most of your colleagues are going to come to the office and you're going to work from home, it's out of sight, out of mind. And again, the ones that are going to suffer the most are the ones that need to be at home. It's the working mothers, it's the underprivileged communities, And I don't think that we have a good solution for that. Instead of saying, okay, come back to the office, life is great.
That's very, very important. And this thing about daycare, the codes on daycare, I think that that's an important topic to take up and address, because that's a huge stopping point. David, would you like to share about how we can create more of an inclusive and equitable workplace post-pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously an extremely difficult question, and something that we, pre-pandemic, I mean, as a mission-driven not-for-profit, our focus is on creating high-quality jobs and connecting local residents, not just to the skills, not just to the jobs, but also the skills that are required for those jobs in the future. And this is a challenging set of issues for our city, as the skills required for career type jobs just continue to escalate faster and faster and faster. So I mean, I feel like I could talk at great length about policy adjustments that need to be made there. Thinking as an employer, we have a very, I think we're an interesting case study, because I'm in our office space, beautiful offices, view of Manhattan. And we've got about 100 or so administrative staff and about 140 frontline union staff, our carpenters, electricians, plumbers, security officers, and like. And we're very aware that work from home and the hybrid model will become another front on the battle for talent, and so we're going to have to engage there. But that's a benefit that we can only provide to the administrative staff, and that opens a very a complicated set of issues there. And I think the only answer to that is like radical honesty about that. And as we are making decisions about the ability to work from home for our administrative staff, we are pausing at each one of those decisions and saying, okay, now what is the position? What is, how can we adjust the work of our non-administrative staff to at least recognize that there are these inequalities, and in the market we could probably just ignore them, and say the market price for labor is what it is, and we're just going to go out and attract who we can, but that as a mission-driven not-for-profit, walking the walk of our mission as an employer, and also trying to build a culture where these teams work together, we can't simply just say, you know what, this is a benefit that one group of our employees get and the other one, sorry, you just have to be on site, you're out of luck. And so we're trying to be very honest about it, and stumbling our way through it, frankly.
Look, I think honesty and communication, it keeps coming up as something that's really critical during this time of change, that no matter what, you need to hear what's going on, and you need to communicate what's going on from management's perspective and hear what's going on from the employee's perspective. And Laura, would you like to give us some final words about creating more equitable and inclusive workspaces?
Yeah, I think that clearly we learned that they were like groups that were already, well, they were more impacted by the working from home. But what we also learned, for example, on racism, is that some people had faced a lot of racism in the office and kind of learned that they preferred being working from home. So I think it's again back and forth. I think it's realizing how everybody has a different take on what's good or bad about going back to the office. I think David's point about like, okay, if we get the staff, administrative staff to be at home, what does it mean? So I heard lately an organization who was thinking of like people who could not, who were taking care of facilities, to give them some days off, because they're like, all the others can work from home, so we should give you something back. So I think it's a lot about norms and policy and giving, a chance. I think the question about promotions is also super important. So making sure that, if people choose to not come back to the office as much as others because they feel more comfortable at home, making sure that they have the same, types of promotions. And it can be sometimes from leadership deciding that you're not going to be in the office. Like I think it was the CEO of Quora who decided that no one in the leadership should go more than once or twice a month to the office to kind of send a message so that people didn't feel like, oh, you know, if I'm going to the office, I'll be seen. So I think it's a lot about policy roles, just awareness and communication. I think all of these elements together, and again, I think it's an opportunity. It kind of, you know, showed a lot of issues, but I think it's also, as we're in a phase of experimentation, it's a place where, you know, companies and organizations can try to solve some of these issues. So I'm hopeful. So, you know, sometimes people tell me like, oh, don't you think that we're just going to go back to what we have? Maybe history shows that we, you know, human beings sometimes just go back and repeat, but, you know, there are times where we kind of learn something and we increment. So I'm hopefully we're going to move to the next step.
I love that thought of that there's an opportunity here for growth, and that if we can look at it that way, and that we can find it as a way to be able to meet people's needs where they are, it can become a positive experience moving forward and better for everyone. We did run a little bit long because you had so many amazing things to say. I just want to hit a couple quick questions. Orly wanted to know, you know, what can companies do to support efficient work from home?
I think it's pretty simple. Is be very open to the notion of working from home, and B, to have a good understanding what's the condition at home and fill the gap if needed. So for instance, one of the things that we are doing automatically using technology is to assess the conditions at home versus the work that is required to be done, and based on that make a recommendation whether this person should work from home or should come to the office.
Good feedback on that. Leo wanted to know, what do you think is the secret to design and use organizational space in a way that attracts workers back to the office? Leo talks about how recently Apple's management faced some backlash when they did 3 days a week on site, even though they have these exceptional workspaces. So, I mean, Anne-Laure, is there anything in your research, or Guy, David, is there anything in your experience? You know, obviously you shared with us about the importance of the why, sharing with everyone why it's so important to be there. But is there any sort of design or organizational that is found to be more appealing?
So my view is very not popular, I'm afraid. Is start designing an office that is going to help employees achieve their goals. Apple is a perfect example, because you can't go from one meeting room to the other if you need to go through a circle. So literally you are walking for 15 minutes from one side of the office. It's a beautiful office. The architect thinks it's nice, but it's not functional. You're looking on an open floor plan. If I need to do an audit as an accountant, it can be great, the football table, but it's not going to achieve what I want to do. On the other end, if I need an opportunity to have a random conversation with David, it will be great if the office is going to facilitate that. So I think that the notion of we are going to create a theme park in the office because it's cool and that's what lure employees is a little bit naive and definitely premature.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think it's like, let's not, you know, be childish. I mean, people have been, you know, spending more than a year working from home and keep up the good work for the organization. So thinking that we're going to lure them by providing them like foosball or whatever other things, I don't think is the issue. I think really thinking about spaces that really support the work. And then again, it's about like understanding, and I think we've all talked about different needs and different occupations and organizational culture and different types of work. So being aware of what, you know, your organization is about. So, you know, if it's a place where people tend to do more solitary work, they don't necessarily want to have everything being like this big open plan where, you know, we can all chat. They still need it because we know from studies that even if you're doing individual work, there's like knowledge sharing that happens. but it might not be the same thing as if you're in an organization where it's, more group work or things like that. Just an example, I've been on a jury for a student project designer for designing furniture for the Office of Tomorrow. And there was one, kind of a system where people could meet, and it was with tatami, you have to take off your shoes and this and that. And one of it, there was the head of HR of an insurance, company is like, nobody, in my company, but then there is a healthcare tech company. She's like, oh, they're going, my people are going to like it so much that they might just think it's like, nap time. And so they're not going to talk together. So I think it's really going back to, understanding the type of work, the organizational culture, and the different needs.
It sounds like communication again, right? It's about communication within your organization, knowing what works for people and what's needed to get the job done and for people to advance their careers and be successful.
Yeah, and empowering them. I think empowering them and not like realizing that, I think that's what people, enjoyed about, even though we all complain about things being, working from home, I think that this notion that we had some control and empowerment, I think is what people enjoyed. And that's, I think, that what they're worried of losing by going back to the office.
Very good point. And a wonderful, wonderful point to end on. I want to thank you. We had such incredible panelists, Guy Vardy, David Ehrenberg, Anne-Laure Fayard. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and providing us with your expertise. Thank you to NYU Tandon for sponsoring this wonderful webinar. I want to thank all of our attendees for spending some of your afternoon with us. And as I shared, this was recorded. We will share it with you so that you can watch it again. You could share it with your community. You could share it with your companies and your employees. Please do. And I want to wish you all to stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.